15 forgotten beers only true Canadians remember. Before craft cans and hazy IPAs filled store shelves, beer in Canada sounded different. It hissed when a church key pried the cap loose, and it clunked onto the kitchen table in short, stubby bottles that left cold rings on the oilcloth. These were the beers that stocked basements, legion halls, and fishing cabins from coast to coast. They tasted simple, sharp, and loyal, flavor that never tried to impress. Every province had one that felt like its own badge of belonging. Today we're looking back at 15 Canadian beers that once ruled the country, before mergers and marketing erased their names from the shelves. Dow Ale came first whenever people talked about lost brews. Brewed in Quebec City and Montreal, it was smooth, golden, and proud, until the cobalt scare of 1965 changed everything. When reports claimed a few drinkers had fallen ill from trace metals, panic spread faster than the truth. Dow's reputation collapsed overnight. For many Quebecers, that red and cream label still carries the sting of something trusted that vanished too soon. Older bartenders can still describe its clean finish and how quickly the taps ran dry that summer. In Ontario, nothing said Saturday night like Carling Black Label. Its jingle, "Hey Mabel," Black Label, blared from radios and early television sets through the 1950s and 60s. The beer was crisp, faintly bitter, built for long shifts and short paychecks. At 45 cents a bottle, it was cheap enough for a whole case at the cottage. Couples danced beside jukeboxes in taverns that smelled of smoke, malt, and sweat. When Carling merged and production drifted south, it felt as if a piece of small-town Ontario had been packed away with it. Labatt 50 Ale might still sit on shelves, but its legend belongs to another time. Introduced in 1950 to honor 50 years of partnership between the Labatt brothers, it quickly became the working person's ale. Dominion Bureau reports from 1967 listed it as Canada's best-selling beer. It poured deep amber with a bite that felt older than you were. Fathers cracked one open while Hockey Night in Canada played in the background, and sons learned that this was what adulthood tasted like, not glamorous, but steady. Brading's Ale was Ottawa's pride long before the capital became known for paperwork. The brewery's brick walls stood near the Rideau Canal, shipping bottles by rail from Pembroke to Kingston. When Brading's merged with O'Keefe and disappeared into Carling, locals mourned as if a neighbor had moved away. Old ads promised a beer as honest as the men who drink it, and that line still sums up its appeal, brewed for cold nights and real thirst. Montrealers once raised glasses of O'Keefe ale with the same pride others saved for champagne. It sponsored early Hockey Night in Canada broadcasts and hung its name across the forum itself. The ale was mild, softly carbonated, unmistakably local. When Molson absorbed O'Keefe in the 1980s, another French-Canadian chapter quietly closed. Hearing the name still brings back the echo of an organ warming before a Canadiens game. Out west, Red Cap Ale marked celebration in Kitchener-Waterloo long before Oktoberfest drew crowds. Brewed by Carling, it came in squat brown bottles topped with a tiny Red Cap logo that looked almost homemade. At 35 cents in 1963, it appeared at wedding receptions and curling banquets alike. The ale's malty sweetness lingered just long enough to invite another sip. When production ended, people didn't just lose a beer, they lost the taste of family gatherings that had always ended with a toast. Old Vienna, or OV, carried a gentler nostalgia. First brewed in Hamilton and later bottled across Ontario, it called itself the smooth beer for modern Canadians. The slogan stuck. By the late 1960s, you could find OV stacked in corner stores beside Wonder Bread and Red Rose tea. Workers coming off late shifts grabbed a six-pack on the way home, trusting its mellow flavor to soften the day. Those stubby bottles left faint orange rings on coffee tables, a quiet signature of Canadian evenings before light beers took over. For Newfoundlanders, Black Horse Ale still stands as proof that loyalty can survive distance. Strong, dark, and slightly bitter, it was the island's badge of pride. Posters showed fishermen in yellow slickers hoisting glasses after a day at sea. Mainland drinkers called it beer that bites back, but locals heard that as a compliment. Even Newfoundlanders living away from home kept a soft spot for that golden horse on green, a postcard in liquid form. Halifax had Dominion Ale, the Maritime beer that weathered decades of storms. A simple pale ale with a faint floral note, it poured in waterfront pubs where sailors traded stories of gales and groundings. The brewery's sign once lit Barrington Street, glowing over the harbor. When production stopped, the glow vanished too, but the memory lingered, beer that tasted like salt, sunshine, and home. Northern Quebec claimed Laurentide Lager, proudly branded La Bière du Nord. Brewed in Shawinigan, it served the snowmobile trails and frozen lakes of the 60s and 70s. Bottles pulled from outdoor sheds came already frosted, snapping open with a sound that matched skates on ice. When the line ended, silence followed, the kind that only absence makes. By the early 1970s, Canadians had started trading loyalty for novelty. Breweries merged, ads grew glossier, and national labels swallowed regional ones. Yet the memories of those lost ales stayed vivid, the chill of glass against a palm after shoveling snow, the hiss of a cap flicked off with a pocket knife, the first swallow cutting through wood smoke air. These beers weren't about tasting notes or image. They were about arrival, that small perfect moment when the workday ended and the warmth began. Molson Golden Ale arrived as a promise of progress. First brewed in the early 1960s, it aimed higher than the working-class staples that filled fridges. Advertisements showed couples in tailored coats clinking bottles on cottage decks and ski lodge patios, the amber catching late-day light. At 55 cents a bottle, it cost a little more than Molson Export, and that extra dime tasted like success. Smooth, faintly sweet, and balanced, it became the drink of new homeowners and office workers who wanted to feel that their hard work had paid off. When the line vanished from shelves in the 1980s, its name lingered like a song everyone once knew by heart. Simcoe Lager lived shorter, louder, and closer to the water. Brewed in Ontario's cottage country during the early 1970s, it was the beer of dock radios and campfires. The label showed the outline of the province's lakes, and its flavor matched the image, light, crisp, and gone before the ice in the cooler melted. Local papers ran weekend ads reading, "Simcoe, as refreshing as the water itself." The brewery folded before the decade ended, but people who camped along those shores still remember the rattle of cans in a trunk, the metallic snap of the first one beside a smoky fire, and how good it felt to sit back and do nothing. Bohemian was Saskatchewan's quiet legend. Long before boho described fashion, it meant the beer that ended a harvest. Brewed in Regina, it poured pale gold and carried the grainy sweetness of prairie barley. Farmhands lined up for it at hotel bars where the floorboards creaked and the jukebox played Patsy Cline. Dominion Bureau figures from 1965 showed Saskatchewan drinking more domestic beer per person than any other province, proof that wide skies and long winters demanded something sturdy in a glass. When the bigger breweries bought it out, locals swore the flavor changed, even if the label stayed the same. Still, for the people who grew up there, Bohemian will always taste like the end of a long, honest day. Alpine Lager was the Maritime's in a bottle. Brewed in St. John, New Brunswick, it first hit shelves in 1937 and became a regional giant by the 1960s. The slogan, "For people who know beer," wasn't bragging, just truth. Crisp, clean, and built for fishermen, mill workers, and dock hands, it quenched without fuss. Advertisements showed couples in wool sweaters laughing on rocky beaches, a scene that could have been any coastal town from Yarmouth to Gaspé. Even after big companies took over, Alpine's blue and white bottles still appeared at weddings and parish halls, the way a family keeps an old recipe alive. The label survived, but the flavor most people remember belongs to another century. Cariboo Genuine Draft was British Columbia's wild card. Born in Prince George during the 1970s, it appealed to loggers, students, and anyone who wanted a decent beer for less than $1. Its green and gold label showed a proud caribou against mountain pines. For years, deliveries wound south along narrow highways to Vancouver and Kamloops. Drinkers remember its faint sweetness and how cold it stayed even in August heat. The early version disappeared, later revived under new owners, but the original remains a ghost, a reminder of when BC beer still tasted like something made down the road. By the late 1970s, the Canadian beer fridge was changing shape. The stubby bottle, that short, sturdy symbol of home, was replaced by tall, international glass. Ads traded cottages for nightclubs, plaid shirts for ski suits. The voice of beer grew louder, but something quieter slipped away. For decades, those regional brews had carried intimacy. They belonged to corner taverns, where everyone knew the bartender's name, to curling banquets that ended in off-key singing, to the small relief of a cold bottle after 12 hours on your feet. They weren't designed for image, they were designed for belonging. The decline of local breweries didn't happen overnight. It melted away like the last snow on a roof, a little each year until the eaves ran dry. Mergers folded century-old names into distant corporations. Labels vanished, replaced by national brands that promised sameness over soul. Newspapers called it modernization. Drinkers called it missing something. In garages and kitchens, people still lined their shelves with empties because the bottles themselves had weight. Thick glass, stubby pride, proof that they'd worked for what they were about to enjoy. Those forgotten beers tell more than a drinking story. They trace the rhythm of a country learning itself. In Quebec, Dow and Laurentide carried language and pride. In the Maritimes, Alpine and Dominion Ale proved that small provinces could have big traditions. On the prairies, Bohemian and Red Cap turned hard work into reason to celebrate. Out west, Molson Golden and Cariboo spoke to ambition, to a new middle class chasing comfort without forgetting roots. Each one reflected Canada's character, patient, proud, and quietly determined. Even now, when craft taps stretch across every bar and labels boast hops from half a world away, those old names echo in memory. They recall basements lined with knotty pine, card games on folding tables, cold nights softened by laughter. The bottles are gone, but the feeling remains. Crack open any beer today, and behind that first hiss, you can still hear Dow, O'Keefe, and Alpine, the sound of Canada in its simplest, truest form. So here's to the 15 that built our weekends. They were brewed with patience, poured with pride, and remembered not for their logos, but for the people who raised them. They tasted like pine smoke, snow melt, and Friday relief. Long before variety took over, these were the beers that meant home, and for many they always will. By the 1980s, the sound of Canadian beer had changed. Factories hummed louder than taverns, and the clink of stubby bottles gave way to the hollow pop of aluminum cans. Breweries that once smelled of barley and yeast were turned into office blocks or parking lots. The country was wealthier now, faster, more efficient, and somehow quieter. Yet in kitchens and garages from Windsor to Corner Brook, The old names still surfaced whenever talk turned to how things used to taste. Those early beers carried more than flavor, they carried identity. Every province had one that felt like a small flag in a bottle. In Quebec, a case of Dow or Laurentide meant pride in language and craft. In Newfoundland, Black Horse told you that home wasn't far. Prairie farmers swore by Bohemian. Dock workers in St. John's stacked Alpine at every wedding hall. Ontario families loaded old Vienna into coolers for a weekend at the lake. Each was a quiet act of belonging, an everyday way of saying, "This is where I'm from." Beer connected strangers long before screens ever could. At Legion halls, men who'd fought in different wars found the same ease in a pint of 50 ale. On cottage docks, neighbors passed bottles back and forth without asking whose turn it was to buy. At wedding dances and company picnics, a cooler of Red Cap or Molson Golden meant celebration without extravagance. The beer itself was ordinary, but the moments it created carried entire evenings. People traded stories about weather, wages, and hockey until the bottles emptied and the world felt lighter. Through the 1950s and 60s, advertisements began to dress beer in new clothes. Television promised youth and confidence, but in most homes it remained what it had always been, a pause between work and worry. A miner in Sudbury rinsed the grit from his throat with the same beer a fisherman sipped in Yarmouth after hauling nets. The labels differed, the wages too, but the ritual never changed. Open, pour, exhale, and forget the cold for a while. In a country that measured distance in days and weather in extremes, that small ritual meant more than luxury ever could. When the mergers came, few realized an era was ending. Breweries that had survived fires, wars, and depressions were folded into corporations with distant headquarters. Distribution grew smoother, flavor grew thinner. The words imported and premium replaced local and fresh. People still drank, but they stopped recognizing what they were drinking. It wasn't betrayal, just progress that moved faster than the heart could follow. And so those familiar names slipped quietly into the background, tucked behind the taste of something newer. But nostalgia has its own kind of fermentation. It waits. Decades later, when someone finds a stubby bottle in a barn or a rusted cap under the porch, a whole evening comes rushing back, the laughter, the smoke, the steady warmth of people who had earned their rest. That's what these forgotten beers hold now. Proof that ordinary life once felt solid enough to toast. Historians call the post-war decades years of quiet prosperity, but for most Canadians they were the years of small joys. Beer fit perfectly into that rhythm. It didn't need ceremony. You could sit on the front step with a friend, share a cold one, and watch the northern sky fade through every shade of blue. For the price of a few coins, you bought an hour of peace. Those hours became the background sound of a country growing up, steady, unpretentious, and kind. When today's craft brewers talk about reviving heritage styles, they're really chasing a feeling, beer that tastes of place, not marketing. Some come close using prairie barley or maritime hops, but even the best replicas can't reproduce the time itself. What made those old brews special wasn't only their recipe, it was the rhythm of life around them. The factory whistle at 5 o'clock, the screen door slamming as someone came in with a six-pack, the hiss of the first bottle while the radio called another goal for the Canadians. The taste was memory made liquid. Looking back, it's clear how those lost labels mirrored the country that brewed them. Practical, modest, proud of hard work. Canada's geography demanded patience, and its beer reflected that. Fermentation took time, delivery took miles, and enjoyment required slowing down. Each region built its own balance of bitterness and sweetness, just as the people did. To lift a glass of Dow or Dominion Ale was to take part in a national story. one written not in books but in evenings shared around kitchen tables. Today, a new generation finds endless variety at the tap, but fewer roots beneath it. Maybe that's why the old names still tug at memory. They remind us that pride once came in smaller doses. A six-pack on payday, a stubby on the tailgate, a laugh under yellow kitchen light. Those moments weren't photographed or posted. They were lived, then remembered the way good beer is remembered, by taste, not label. Every country has its comfort food. Canada, for a long while, had its comfort beers. They filled the space between winter and wages, between effort and ease. They marked the end of the work week and the start of friendship. Even their disappearance tells a story worth keeping, that progress can make life easier without always making it better. So if you ever see one of those names, Dow, O'Keefe, Red Cap, Bohemian, Alpine, printed on a sign or tucked inside an antique shop, stop for a moment. Picture the hands that once lifted it, the laughter that followed, the steam on the kitchen window after someone came in from the cold. That's the taste we're really remembering. It isn't about beer at all. It's about belonging. And maybe that's why these 15 forgotten beers still matter. They built warmth in a country that spends half its year fighting winter. They taught us that comfort can come from something as simple as a shared bottle, a shared story, or a shared silence while snow drifts past the window. Long after the last stubby was recycled, the feeling stayed, the quiet Canadian satisfaction of raising a glass and knowing you were home.